So I was having a conversation with a student, and we were talking about spacing and vertical rhythm and the effects that it can have on how legible a design is, the ease of reading it, and just the overall like aesthetic that you can achieve when you're aware of the spacing. So I have this mock-up to show you an example of good spacing and then an example of off spacing or poor spacing, and we're going to just talk about how we can achieve these effects. So I'm going to go into Sketch, and I'm using Sketch. You might be using Photoshop. Both will have this function of looking at a grid, and so that's what these blue lines are indicating. So I'm looking at this grid, and I can look at my grid settings. By default, there's usually some kind of default setting for the grid. I like an 8-pixel grid because I like a 16-pixel base font size for my designs. 16 pixels is a good base font size because it's big enough to be really legible and just gives you a lot of flexibility like that. And 8 pixels is small enough where you can have some variation in your spacing, but also big enough where it becomes manageable. Okay. So this is an example of the good spacing mock-up, and let me turn it off the grid real quick just so we can look at it. So this is like an article for a newspaper called Science Daily. There's some navigation. There's a title, a quick description. There's a byline, body text. There's some sidebar areas here. A photo with a caption, and that's it. And so I think this is pretty readable. I think it looks pretty good. The spacing seems fine. It makes it legible. And if we go over to the example with off spacing, yeah, there's just something about it that just seems a little bit off. And we're not really from right now. I can't really tell you exactly what's going on. We'll go into that in a bit. But yeah, just looking at this seems off. Like this seems inconsistent with this text size, and this body copy seems really tight. But then there's a lot of space in between each paragraph, and then there seems to be some weirdness in between, and with the spaces in the sidebar stuff too. And then yeah, this image. There's like a lot of space over here and less over here, so we can learn more about the spacing inconsistencies when we turn on the grid. So let's go back here, and I'm going to turn my grid back on. Okay, so let me zoom in, and there's 3 basic concepts when it comes to spacing and vertical rhythm: the font size, the line height or the leading, and the margin on the top and bottom. So let's go into this, the title here. And I'm sorry this is a little hard to read. Let me kill the background color there. Okay, so we see our grid. So each square is 8 pixels by 8 pixels. And we can see our title here. And you'll notice that the glyph height, which is the total height of this sentence, this string, it fits nicely inside these boxes into this grid. And you'll notice here this doesn't line up exactly, and that's okay. How it's aligning on the left and right is determined by the layout, which is another thing that you can apply to your canvas. And you can see here it's lining up with my layout nicely. And so this is our 12-column layout. And maybe we'll cover that in another video. But for now, let's just worry about the vertical spacing. I'm going to turn that off. Okay, so it's an 8-point grid. We need to think about the font size, the leading or the line height, and the margin on the top and bottom. So when I look at this thing, I can see the font size is 24, its line height is 24, its paragraph is 15. This could be 0. It's not a paragraph, it's just one line of text. And there's no margin per se in here in Sketch, but we can still talk about it. So 24, 24. Now it's an 8-pixel grid, 16 pixel base font size, and since 24 is divisible by 8 in a clean way, it's going to fit really nicely in here. And then also we can count the margin on top and bottom. So in this case, I'm just going to count the number of 8 pixel blocks here. So this is 6 on top and on bottom. So this is perfectly centered inside of this this header div. And because of that, it's going to read really well. So this is a really good example of achieving vertical rhythm. And now if I scroll over to these guys, you'll see the same things happening. So these are my navigation items, and you'll see they fit really nicely inside of these two boxes. And so if these are 8 pixels, then you can assume that this is going to be a 16 pixel font and 16 pixel line height, and that's exactly what we have here. Now there are going to be more boxes on top than on bottom, and that's okay, because the effect that I'm trying to get here is that there's alignment on the baseline. So if I click into here and then I scroll over, you can see that the bottom of the glyph for both of these fonts, they're all on the same line in the grid. So that's the effect that I was going for. I could have vertically centered these things, and you can do that really easily in Sketch. You can do that. That's going to take it off the grid, and in this case I think that's okay, but you can see here now that the glyphs are kind of like straddling the center of each of these squares, and that might be okay in this instance. My personal taste is that I'm just going to have it flush at the bottom of that grid. Okay, let's move on. So we had this big headline, and yeah, so same principle, right? Like you can see here the glyphs, they fit. I'm hoping you guys can see this, but there's a line here, and it's just perfectly flush inside of the grid that we've established. And so same principle, we have a 48 pixel font, a 48 line height set on the font, and so that's going to give us that really nice effect. The margin on the bottom in this case is 1, 2, 3, 4 8 pixel grids down, and so again, going back to CSS land, we would set our M to 16 times actually I can't do math that well. So it would be 3M. So this if this is a H2, H2 would be set to font size 3M, because remember our base font size is 16, which is divisible by 8, and so that's what makes this fit really nicely in here. And the margin is going to be 2M, which is going to give us the space that we need between this H1 and this, this H2 and this H3. And so yeah, we're just keeping this pattern going. Now 26 is not cleanly divisible by 8 or 16, and that's okay, as long as the math adds up into a number that is divisible by the base font size. And so we have a line height that is also or that is a little bit bigger than the base font, or than this font size. That's going to give us a little bit more leading in between these lines, which I want, because this line might be a little bit longer than a headline, and so I want that to be a little bit more legible when the lines do wrap. But you can see here again, it's fitting really nicely inside of this grid. So the top and bottom of the glyph is fitting inside of that the grid. Okay, so here we have here we're mixing fonts and mixing some of the transforms we have on the font. So the name is in all caps, and then we have an italic byline. But yeah, it's all the same principles. Now we have a 16 pixel font size, 24 line height. So that's going to take up 3 of these grid rows that you can see here, but it's still fitting in really nicely. And again, we have we have some margins set here. This time it's only 3 of these grid rows, so that would be M, our margin on the bottom is 1.5 M. So that would be 24 pixels. And then with the body copy, so now that we have body copy and we have paragraphs, we do have to consider the margin in between each paragraph. In Sketch, there is a paragraph value here. In CSS, this would be margin on the top or bottom, depending on how you want to write that style. But again, same principle. We're using the base font size. This is a line height that would equal 1.75 for the leading or for the line height. I like that. A lot of people would just use 1.5. I think 1.75 just gives it a little bit more room and makes it a little bit easier to read. That will depend on the font. For a sans serif like this, I think it works really well. And then we're using 24 pixels to separate each paragraph. And again, you can see this is just flush up with that grid row. Okay, now for this image, so we want to have an image. The way that the spacing rules for the images are, I believe it's nine of these grid rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, and you can see this image is flush up against that grid row, and so we want 9 of these grid rows, which if we do some quick math, 8 times 9. So we're gonna have 72 pixels of space between the paragraph and the image. And then in CSS, we would write this as, so this would be 4.5 M. So we could write that style as P plus image tag. So the plus sign is a sibling selector. So whenever there's an image next to a P, we're going to add 4.5 M's of margin on the top, and that'll push it down. We have this little caption here for the image, and so again we're using, this is a bit smaller size for the image. The line height is 16, so again it's going to take up 2 of those grid rows. It's going to fit really nicely into that, and then there should be 9 grid rows to separate it, so it's going to be again 4.5 M margin on the bottom to separate the image now from the rest of the text. Okay, so main principles: think about the font size, the line height, and the margin on the top and bottom. Think about what kind of like baseline grid you want to set. I recommend 8 pixels because I like 16-point base font sizes, and it's just a matter of like making sure everything kind of lines up really nicely with that grid. This was there's a lot of like minutia here and just like nudging things and making sure things fit really nicely together. In my experience, this is way harder to do in Sketch than in like CSS and HTML, because you can just write these rules in CSS and then you just write your HTML and these rules will be applied. With Sketch, it's a bit harder because you just have to like visually see it and line it up nicely. Okay, so let's go into the bad example and we can compare what we just did. Okay, so starting at the top. All right, so here we have, so the size change, so it's 19. So 19 is not a good size, doesn't really match up really nicely with our grid. Yeah, it's kind of an odd number. And then again, the line height is 19. That's not really going to line up nicely with the grid. And you can see here the glyph size of this font is just not aligned with the grid. And then the same thing for these guys. They're just like not aligned. Again, kind of an odd font size. If we if we divide this by 8, it's going to give us a weird number, and the line height as well. And yeah, you can just see here that the glyphs just aren't lining up with the grid. With this this like little summary line here, it's not lining up. The line height is really big, so there's just like a little bit too much space, I think, to make that look legible, and then that's mucking up this this alignment here. And with this body copy, so we have a 16-point grid. The line height is 21, which is a little tight. And you can see here it's definitely a lot tighter than it was in the previous one. And then the paragraph, so the number of pixels that's separating each paragraph is also kind of an odd number, and it's really big. So it's creating a lot of space in between these paragraphs, and the tightness of each paragraph with the separation is just creating an odd combination, and I think that just makes it difficult to read. And then finally over here, yeah, same kind of principle. So this is actually good. So we're using that 8-point grid. It's just not and yeah, you can see here. So this is a 13 font size with a 24 line line height, and it's fitting nicely into the grid. But then there's not enough margin on the bottom, and so we have this overlap in where the glyphs are ending up. And so that's just 1 pixel, so I can move that down fairly easily. And now we want to make sure that the spacing between these is all consistent. And so here, if we wanted to do so 1em or 16 pixels, which would be 2 of these rows, we can just move this guy down 3 pixels. And then same deal. So we want to move this, we got to move this guy down a little bit. And then we'll just make all these flush. So now that's a little bit easier to read. So that's all I wanted to go over. I hope this makes sense. It's hard to like see this kind of stuff, and it's hard to identify it when you're new to design. And I hope that you can see the difference and feel the difference as you read. If you were to read through these, see the difference, feel the difference. I hope this one is a bit easier to read than this one. But these concepts are very core to visual design, so it's good to get familiar with some of these concepts. That's it. Thanks for listening and watching.